The sun over Dust Hollow was not a source of life, but a judgment, a white-hot eye in a bleached sky that baked the cracked clay of the street until it was hard as bone. Sam Coltrane led his pack mule through the heat, the air thick with the smells of horsehide stale beer and resignation. Beside him, his 6-year-old son Eli walked with a quietness that was too old for his small frame. His hand gripping Sam's, his gaze fixed on the dust, his boots kicked up. They were in town for flour salt and a new axe head, a simple trip that felt like a journey into a foreign country. The ranch was silence and space. Dust Hollow was noise and constriction. Suddenly, a sound cut through the low hum of the town and the frantic, desperate clang of a bell. Not the steady toll for church or the alarm for a fire, but a panicked, jagged ringing that spoke of trouble. People stopped, heads turning toward the far end of the street where Mayfield's Mercantile, a failed business propped up by little more than hope, now stood with its door hanging off one hinge like a broken jaw. A man's voice, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, sliced through the air. Debts will be paid, Mayfield, one way or another. The splintered door was kicked open fully, and Jeb Crowley emerged, dragging a young woman by the arm. He was flanked by 2 of his men, their faces impassive and mean. The woman, Karen Mayfield, stumbled, but did not fall. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her face smudged with dust, but her back was a straight, defiant line. She fought against Crowley's grip, not with frantic struggling, but with a stiff, unyielding resistance that seemed to infuriate him more than any scream. "Get your hands off me," she said, her voice low and shaking with fury, not fear. Crowley laughed, a dry, ugly sound. He shoved her toward the center of the street where a makeshift auction block, nothing more than 2 barrels and a plank, was being hastily assembled by his men. "You hear that, boys? She's still giving orders. After her father gambled away every last penny he owed me, she thinks she has a say." He turned to the growing crowd, his voice booming with theatrical authority. "This is what happens when you welch on a debt to Jeb Crowley. There's always something left to collect." He forced her onto the platform. Her hands were bound in front of her with a length of rough rope. As he cinched it tight, something glinted at her throat, a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. Sam froze. The sounds of the street faded to a dull roar in his ears. The locket. It was almost identical to the one Mary had worn every day, the one he had given her on their first anniversary. It had been a small, inexpensive thing, but she had treasured it. He remembered the way her fingers would trace the floral engraving when she was lost in thought. He remembered the feel of its cool metal against his lips when he kissed her neck. He remembered the locket lying on the undertaker's table, tarnished with a single, dark speck of her blood. The memory was a physical blow, sharp and agonizing, stealing the air from his lungs. He saw Mary's face, not Karen's. He saw her smile, her eyes, her life force, and the brutal, senseless way it had been extinguished. On the stage, Crowley was enjoying his power, circling Karen like a wolf. "Let's see what we have here. Healthy stock, strong, a bit spirited, but that's nothing a firm hand can't fix." The crowd, drawn by the spectacle, murmured and shuffled. Some men leered, others looked on with a kind of grim fascination. This wasn't a legal auction. It was a spontaneous act of cruelty, a public foreclosure of a human being, and the town was too scared of Crowley to intervene. "She looks sad, Pa," Eli whispered, his small voice pulling Sam from the grip of his memory. "Like Mama did." Sam looked down at his son, then back at the woman on the stage. He saw the tremble in her hands, the fierce pride in her eyes that refused to be broken. He saw the locket. And in that moment, it wasn't about pity or justice. It was about a ghost. It was about a debt he felt he still owed to the memory of his wife, to protect the light from the darkness that had consumed her. He let go of Eli's hand and began to walk forward, a silent, solitary figure, moving against the current of the crowd. The journey to the ranch was a long exercise in silence. The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted road, kicking up a fine red dust that coated everything in a layer of rust. Karen sat on the buckboard, her bound wrists now free, but still raw and red, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had not spoken a word since Sam had placed a single gold coin on the auction block, his voice low and steady, silencing the jeering crowd with a quiet authority she couldn't comprehend. "I'm not buying her," he had said. "I'm taking her home. My son needs a mother." The words had hung in the air, a statement of fact so strange and absolute that not even Crowley had challenged it. Sam drove the horses with a steady hand, his eyes scanning the landscape. It was a sea of sun-scorched clay, where the shadows of the mesas stretched like the skeletal fingers of forgotten giants. The land was harsh and unforgiving, yet possessed a stark, lonely beauty. As the sun began to dip low, the red sand glowed like embers under the fading light, and the sky bled into hues of violent purple and soft rose. When they finally arrived, the ranch was little more than a silhouette against the twilight. The house was a simple wooden structure weathered by years of wind and sun, its porch sagging slightly on one side. A lone windmill creaked a mournful rhythmic song. Karen stepped down from the wagon, her movements stiff. The silence here was different from the tense quiet of the journey. It was a heavy presence, thick with an unspoken grief, that settled deep in her bones, reminding her of the suffocating stillness of her own home after her mother had passed. Sam led her inside. "The guest room is yours," he said, his voice practical, devoid of emotion. "You'll have your privacy." The air inside smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of lavender that felt out of place, a ghost of a gentler time. As Sam lit a lamp, the small house flickered to life, revealing sparse but clean furniture, a stone fireplace and floors swept bare. There were no feminine touches, no curtains on the windows, no flowers in a vase. It was a place of pure function, a shelter, not a home. From the shadows of a hallway, a small face peeked out. It was the boy Eli, his hair a tangle of sun-bleached blonde, his eyes large and hollow. He clutched a worn wooden horse, its paint faded, and one leg slightly askew. He stared at Karen with an unnerving intensity, his expression a blank slate, before vanishing back into the darkness. "That's Eli," Sam said, as if no further explanation were needed. "He doesn't talk, not since his mother." The words hung between them, another layer of quiet grief in a house already full of it. The first few days passed in a slow, uncertain rhythm. Karen kept to herself, moving through the house like a phantom. She found a rhythm in chores, a way to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling. She swept the porch, mended a loose board on the steps, and drew water from the deep, cool well. She worked with a methodical efficiency, creating a small bubble of order in the vast, untamed landscape. Eli remained a creature of the shadows. He watched her. She would feel his eyes on her as she hung laundry on the line, the wind whipping the white sheets around her. She would catch a glimpse of him in a doorway as she kneaded dough in the kitchen, his wooden horse held tight against his chest. He never spoke, never came close, but he was always there, a silent observer of her every move. One morning, she found a single perfect raven's feather placed carefully on the porch railing outside her room. The next day, a smooth gray river stone appeared on the windowsill. She knew they were from him, small silent offerings from a world she couldn't enter. On the fourth day, Karen decided she could no longer live in borrowed silence. After Sam and Eli had left for the far pastures, she explored the room that had clearly belonged to Sam's wife. It was untouched, a shrine of dust and memory. A rocking chair sat by the window, a faded quilt draped over its back. On a small nightstand lay a book of poetry, a silver-backed brush with a few long, dark hairs still caught in its bristles, and a small, locked wooden box. Her fingers trembled as she touched the box. This felt like a violation, a trespass on sacred ground. But the need to understand the silence that permeated every corner of this ranch was stronger than her hesitation. She found a hairpin in her own meager belongings, and with a few delicate probes, the lock clicked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were letters tied with a ribbon, a dried wildflower, and a yellowed newspaper clipping. Her eyes scanned the headline, "Mining claim dispute ends in violence. Gunman Samuel Coltrane kills rival claimant." The date was from 7 years ago. The article was brief, clinical, but the words painted a picture of the man she now lived with, a man whose past was as harsh and deadly as the land he worked. She carefully put the clipping back, her heart pounding. That evening, as the three of them sat at the dinner table, the silence felt different. It was no longer just empty space. It was charged with unspoken questions. Sam finally broke it, his voice low. "The road east is clear. Gates unlocked. Your choice." He wasn't looking at her, but at his plate as if the words were hard for him to say. Karen looked from Sam's stoic face to Eli, who was pushing a pea around his plate with his fork, his eyes downcast. She thought of the world beyond the ranch gates, a world that had chewed her up and spit her out, a world where she was nothing more than collateral, an object to be sold and broken. She thought of the auction block, of Crowley's cruel smile, of the leering faces in the crowd. Then she looked at the silent boy and the grieving man. This place was broken, yes, but its pieces were honest. The grief was real. The quiet was protective, not malicious. Here she was not an object. She was a presence, a mystery they were still trying to solve. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt she had a choice that mattered. "I was trained as a teacher," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than it had been in weeks. Her background was educated, and her speech still held the formal cadence of her past life in the city. The boy, Eli, he should be learning his letters. Sam looked up, his expression unreadable. "And that fence by the west pasture needs mending," she continued, her gaze direct. "I can help. I am stronger than I look." Sam stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. Eli had stopped playing with his food and was watching them both, his eyes wide. "The work is hard," Sam said finally. "I am not afraid of hard work," Karen replied. "I am afraid of what's out there. I think I will stay, if you'll have me." Sam gave a single, slow nod. He said nothing more, but a subtle tension seemed to leave his shoulders. Across the table, Eli picked up his fork and for the first time took a deliberate bite of his food. It was not a celebration, but it was an acceptance. In the quiet of the small, lonely house, Karen Mayfield had made her stand. The gate was unlocked, but she had chosen to stay inside. The quiet rhythm of their lives was shattered 2 weeks later. It was a moonless night, the kind where the stars seemed close enough to touch and the darkness felt absolute. The horses in the corral were restless, snorting and stamping in a way that pulled Sam from a light sleep. He lay still for a moment, listening. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, a disturbance in the deep quiet of the ranch. He rose, pulling on his trousers and boots without lighting a lamp. He moved through the house with the silent grace of a predator, his senses on high alert. As he passed Karen's room, he saw a sliver of light from under her door. She was awake too. He slipped outside, melting into the shadows beside the porch. The air was still, but he could hear it now, a faint scraping sound coming from the direction of the well. He peered into the gloom and saw two figures hunched over the wellhead, working with a furtive urgency. He recognized them immediately as two of Crowley's men. They weren't there for Karen. They were there for the water. To poison the well would be a slow, insidious death sentence for the ranch, far more cruel than a direct assault. Sam's hand instinctively went to the place on his hip where his gun used to hang. The phantom weight was a familiar ache. He had made a promise to Mary, a vow on her grave, that he would never take another life. But that promise had never been tested like this. Suddenly, a flicker of light from the barn. A lantern held by Karen was knocked from a ledge, shattering on the ground. A small contained fire flared up on the hay-strewn floor. Fire, she screamed, her voice cutting through the night. The two men at the well jerked upright, startled. Their attention snapped to the barn, their plan forgotten. What the hell was that, one of them hissed. It was the opening Sam needed. While they were distracted, he moved. He wasn't a gunslinger anymore, but he still knew how to hunt. He circled around them, silent as a ghost, using the deep shadows of the outbuildings as cover. He had anticipated this. The day before, he had noticed the coil of rope by the well had been tampered with. He'd spent the afternoon setting a simple trap, a tripwire connected to a precariously balanced stack of empty barrels behind the woodshed. As Crowley's men started cautiously toward the barn to investigate the commotion, one of them stumbled over the wire. The crash was deafening as the barrels cascaded down a chaotic avalanche of wood and metal. The men yelled in surprise, one stumbling to the ground, the other drawing his pistol and firing blindly into the darkness. Before the second man could aim, Sam was on him. He came out of the night not with a gun, but with the force of a runaway train. He slammed the man's gun hand against the wall of the shed, the crack of bone sharp and ugly in the night air. The pistol clattered to the ground. The first man, scrambling to his feet, found himself staring down the twin barrels of Sam's shotgun, which had been propped against the shed door. "Drop it," Sam's voice was dangerously calm. In the barn, Karen had already smothered the small fire with a horse blanket, the diversion having served its purpose perfectly. She emerged, her face pale in the starlight, but her eyes blazing. Sam held the two men at bay with the shotgun, his finger resting near the trigger. He hadn't broken his vow, he hadn't fired, hadn't killed, but the promise of violence was overwhelming. "This is your only warning," he said, his voice a low growl. "You tell Crowley that my water, my land, and my family are off limits. If I see any of you on my property again, I won't be this polite." The man with the broken wrist cradled his arm, his face twisted in pain. The other stared at Sam, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. They had come expecting to face a broken rancher. They had found the ghost of Sam Coltrane, the gunslinger. "Now get out," Sam ordered. They scrambled away, melting back into the darkness from which they came. Sam stood there for a long moment after they were gone, the heavy shotgun still in his hands. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a familiar bitter taste. Karen walked over to him, her steps quiet in the dirt. "You didn't kill them." "No," he said, his voice strained. He lowered the gun. "I wanted to." "But you didn't," she insisted, her gaze searching his face. "You showed them you could, and then you chose not to. There's more power in that, Sam." He looked at her, at the strength and intelligence in her eyes. She hadn't cowered in the house. She had seen the threat and acted, creating a diversion that was both brilliant and brave. She had been his partner. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "We're protecting our home." She replied simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And in that moment, under the vast, starry sky, the word "our" settled between them, solid and real. The failed attack on the well left a lingering tension over the ranch, but it also solidified a change in Karen. Crowley's cruelty was no longer just a personal grievance. It felt targeted, obsessive. A simple land dispute or a gambling debt didn't explain the lengths he was willing to go to. Her mind, sharp and analytical, began to search for a deeper motive. Her investigation began with quiet questions in town. On a trip for supplies, she sought out Martha, the old woman who had given her the basket of bread. They sat on Martha's porch, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. That Jeb Crowley Karen began casually, he seems to hold a grudge. Martha snorted her wrinkled hands, never stopping their work. Crowley was born holding a grudge. He's a snake, that one. Always has been. Thinks this whole territory belongs to him. Was he always like this with Sam? Karen pressed gently. Martha paused, her gaze turning distant. It got worse after Mary died. Far worse. Most folks figured the robbery that took her was just bad luck. Drifters. But I never bought it. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was too clean, too convenient. Sam had just outbid Crowley on a prime piece of grazing land up north. Crowley was furious. Then a week later, Mary's dead, and Sam is a broken man. He gave up the claims, locked himself away on that ranch. Crowley got what he wanted, didn't he? The old woman's words planted a seed of dark suspicion in Karen's mind. Back at the ranch, she found herself drawn once more to Mary's room, to the locked wooden box. This time she wasn't looking for the ghost of Sam's wife. She was looking for answers. She sifted through the contents again, her fingers tracing the delicate handwriting on the letters. They were mostly love letters, filled with the simple poetry of a life shared. But at the bottom of the box, tucked beneath the false bottom she hadn't noticed before, was a small leather-bound journal. Mary's journal. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The entries detailed the mundane beauty of her life, Eli taking his first steps, the success of their first harvest, her love for Sam. But as she read closer to the final entries, the tone shifted. October 12th. Jeb Crowley was in town today. He looked at Samuel with such hatred. It frightens me. Samuel insists it is just business, a dispute over the northern pasture, but I see something more in Mr. Crowley's eyes. It is a poison that runs deeper than land. October 19th. A man came to the ranch today asking for work. He said his name was Tanner. Samuel sent him away. There was something about his eyes. Cold. I saw him talking to Mr. Crowley in town the next day. Samuel must not know. Karen's blood ran cold. She knew that name. Tanner was one of the men who had come with Crowley to the ranch, one of the men who had tried to poison their well. The seed of suspicion bloomed into a horrifying certainty. This wasn't about land. It was about destroying Sam piece by piece. During this time of quiet investigation, the fabric of their lives at the ranch was being rewoven, thread by thread. They repaired the section of the barn roof, damaged in a summer squall, working in tandem on the high beams, passing tools, and sharing a canteen of water under the hot sun. When a newborn calf fell ill, Karen and Sam took turns through the night, bathing its feverish head with cool cloths and forcing warm milk down its throat. Karen sat in the hay-filled stall, murmuring softly to the animal, and when she looked up, she saw Sam watching her with an expression of profound tenderness. The most powerful change came in the evenings. Karen began teaching Eli to read by the light of the fire. She would guide his small finger across the words in an old primer, her voice soft and patient. C-A-T. Cat. One evening, as they were sounding out words, Eli looked up at her, his brow furrowed in concentration. K-A-R-E-N. He spelled out slowly. He looked at the letters, and then back at her face, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He pointed a finger at her. Karen. It was the first time he had spoken her name. Sam, who had been cleaning a rifle in the corner, went still. Karen's heart swelled. She smiled a genuine, radiant smile. That's right, Eli. Very good. He pointed to Sam. P.A. He looked at his father. Pa. Sam put the rifle down his throat, working. He crossed the room and knelt beside them, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The bond between the three of them was no longer one of necessity or circumstance. It was becoming one of love, fragile yet fierce. They were building a family on the foundations of a shared grief. And the rising suspense of Karen's discovery only made that new foundation feel more precious and more vulnerable. They had everything to lose. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Karen was tidying Mary's room, airing out the heavy grief that still clung to the curtains and the quilt. She picked up the old newspaper clipping again, the one detailing Sam's past as a gunslinger. Samuel Coltrane kills rival claimant Thomas Crowley. Crowley. Her breath hitched. She had dismissed the name before, assuming it was a common one. But now, with Martha's words and Mary's journal fresh in her mind, the name was a thunderclap. She rushed to her own room, retrieving the formal foreclosure notice her father had received before he lost everything. It was signed with a flourish at the bottom. Jebediah T. Crowley. Thomas Crowley, Jebediah Crowley, brothers. Karen sank onto the edge of her bed, the two pieces of paper trembling in her hands. It all made sense. The relentless persecution, the attempts to ruin Sam's businesses over the years, the obsession with the ranch. It was never about money or land. It was about revenge. A cold, patient, meticulous vendetta against the man who had killed his brother. And then the most devastating realization hit her, so monstrous she could barely form the thought. The robbery. Mary's death. It wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a convenient accident. It was a murder orchestrated by Jeb Crowley to inflict the deepest possible pain on his rival. He hadn't just wanted to ruin Sam. He wanted to unmake him, to take away the one person who had pulled him from the abyss of his violent past. He had engineered the event that had shattered Sam's world and silenced his son. The air in the small room felt thin, suffocating. Karen felt a wave of nausea. The fragile peace they had built, the tentative love that was beginning to bloom, it was all built on a lie. Sam believed he had brought the violence into Mary's life through his past, and he carried that guilt like a shroud. But the truth was so much worse. The violence had hunted him down, wearing the mask of random chance. She sat there for hours as the afternoon sun slanted across the floor, the truth a toxic weight in her gut. She was now the sole keeper of a secret that could destroy everything. What could she do? If she told Sam, the man he was now, the quiet, gentle father who had forsaken his guns, would be consumed by the ghost of the man he used to be. The rage and guilt would drive him to a confrontation with Crowley, a confrontation that could only end in more bloodshed, leaving Eli an orphan. Sam would be forced back into the very violence he had fought so hard to escape. But if she kept silent, they would be living a lie. Crowley was still out there, a patient predator, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Her silence would protect their fragile peace for a while, but it would leave them vulnerable, ignorant of the true danger they faced. She would be protecting the man she loved by deceiving him, building their future on a foundation of secrets and unspoken truths. The choice was impossible. Tell him and risk destroying the man he had become. Keep silent and risk losing everything to the man who had been hunting them all along. The setting sun cast her shadow long and dark across the room, a perfect reflection of the terrible choice that lay before her. Crowley, frustrated by Sam's resilience, changed his tactics. He understood now that direct physical threats only served to awaken the dormant gunslinger. Provoking Sam into a fair fight was a fool's errand. Coltrane was too controlled, too committed to his new life, so Crowley decided to attack the very foundation of that life, the land itself. A week after Karen's discovery, a buggy rattled up the path to the ranch. It carried not hired thugs, but a man in a crisp suit and a portly, sour-faced man, identified as Judge Miller from the territorial capital. Jeb Crowley rode alongside them, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. Sam and Karen met them on the porch, Eli hiding behind Karen's skirts. Coltrane, Crowley said, dismounting with a flourish, "I believe you're squatting on my property." The man in the suit, a lawyer named Finch, stepped forward and unrolled a long, official-looking document. According to this deed, filed with the Territorial Office in 1865, this entire parcel of land, including all structures and water rights, was granted to the Crowley family in payment for services to the railroad. Sam's face was a mask of stone. "That's a lie. I bought this land fair and square from the government 10 years ago. I have the papers to prove it." "Ah, yes," Finch said with a slick smile. "Your papers. Forgeries, I'm afraid. Very convincing ones, but fraudulent nonetheless. Judge Miller has reviewed our claim and found it to be legally binding." Judge Miller cleared his throat, avoiding Sam's gaze. "The court has issued a preliminary order of foreclosure. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." It was a perfectly orchestrated legal ambush. The documents were forgeries, of course, but they were expertly done. The judge was corrupt, his pockets undoubtedly lined with Crowley's money. Sam was trapped in a fight he couldn't win with his fists or a gun. This was a battle of paper and ink, of lies, sanctioned by a bought and paid for law. The news spread through Dust Hollow like a grass fire. The townspeople, who had once been a jeering mob, now saw the Coltranes as their own. Martha marched into the saloon and publicly denounced Crowley as a bottom-feeding snake who'd steal the pennies off a dead man's eyes. Others offered support in quieter ways, a basket of eggs left on the porch, a few men showing up to help reinforce the corral fence, their presence a silent statement of solidarity. But they were all powerless. Against a corrupt judge and a forged deed, their goodwill was meaningless. The 30 days were a slow, agonizing countdown to ruin. Sam spent days hunched over his own deed, searching for any detail, any flaw he could use to fight back, but he knew it was hopeless. The weight of impending loss settled over the ranch like a physical shroud. The home he had built with Mary, the land where he had planned to raise his son, and the future he was just beginning to imagine with Karen, it was all being stolen from him, not by a bullet, but by a signature. Karen watched him, her heart breaking. The secret she carried burned within her. She knew this wasn't about the land. It was just another turn of the screw in Crowley's long game of revenge. Several times she opened her mouth to tell him the truth, to reveal the full scope of Crowley's evil, but the words would die in her throat. She would look at Eli, who was finally laughing and speaking in full sentences, and she couldn't bring herself to detonate the bomb that would shatter their world. She chose to fight the battle in front of them, helping Sam draft letters to the territorial governor, clutching at the thinnest straws of hope, all while knowing the real fight was one he didn't even know he was in. Their home was being dismantled from the outside by a legal fiction, and from the inside by a secret she was terrified to speak. The final day arrived with a sky the color of a fresh bruise. A heavy, oppressive stillness hung in the air, a prelude to the violent dust storm brewing on the horizon. By late afternoon, the sun was a hazy orange disk, and the wind began to howl, whipping sand and grit into the air. It was the perfect backdrop for the end of a world. At sunset they came. Crowley flanked by his men, the corrupt Judge Miller, and the town's sheriff, whose reluctance was plain on his face. They rode through the gate, the foreclosure notice held in the judge's hand like a death warrant. Sam, Karen, and Eli stood on the porch, a small defiant island against the encroaching tide. "Time's up," Coltrane Crowley called out over the rising wind. He dismounted, his duster flapping around him. He wasn't just here to evict them. He was here for his final triumph. "It's a pity. You built a nice life here. A new wife, a son who finally talks. All of it on my land." He gestured for two of his men to move forward. "Secure the barn. Make sure they don't take anything that doesn't belong to them." The men advanced, their intent clear. They were heading for Karen and Eli. Sam took a step forward, his body tensing. Ah, Crowley said, holding up a hand. He slowly unbuttoned his duster, revealing the polished Colt revolver at his hip. He drew it not to point it at Sam, but to hold it out, butt first. "This is what you really want, isn't it, Samuel? You can't fight the law. You can't fight my money. But you could fight me. One bullet. Just like you did my brother Thomas." The name landed like a physical blow. Sam's face, which had been a mask of contained anger, fractured with shock and dawning horror. Crowley's smile was a venomous slash. "Oh, you didn't know I knew. I've been watching you for years. Watched you build this life, watched you find a little piece of happiness. And I've been waiting for the right moment to take it all away. Mary's death was just the beginning. I wanted you to feel what it was like to lose everything, to be utterly broken. Now I want to finish it. Draw your gun, Coltrane. Fight me. Let your son see the killer you really are before I put you in the ground." The air crackled with tension. The wind shrieked, tearing at the roof of the porch. Crowley's men had cornered Karen and Eli near the barn door, blocking their escape. It was the ultimate ultimatum: fight and become the monster Crowley claimed he was, or stand down and watch his new family suffer. Sam's hand trembled as it hovered over the gun he hadn't worn in years, but had strapped on that morning. His promise to Mary, his vow, his entire reformed identity, it was all about to be sacrificed. He could see no other way out. His gaze met Karen's, an apology and a farewell in his eyes. He was about to draw. "Don't do it, Pa." The voice was a piercing scream that cut through the howl of the storm. Eli, who had been hiding behind Karen, stepped forward, his small body trembling, but his face set with a fierce, desperate courage. All eyes snapped to him. He pointed a shaking finger at one of Crowley's men, the one called Tanner. "I saw him." Eli cried, his voice ringing with the clarity of a long-suppressed memory. "He was there. The day Mama—" He had a spider on his hand. A dead silence fell, the wind itself seeming to hold its breath. All eyes turned to Tanner, who instinctively glanced down at his right hand, where the faint outline of a crude spider tattoo was visible beneath the grime. Panic flashed across his face. "The boy's lying," Crowley snarled, but the damage was done. Eli wasn't finished. He didn't take her purse, the boy choked out, tears streaming down his face. He just shot her. He looked at me, and he smiled. The public testimony delivered by a child who hadn't spoken of the event in 2 years was a cannonball through Crowley's carefully constructed narrative. It wasn't a random robbery. It was a planned execution. Judge Miller, seeing his conspiracy exposed and the tide turning, began to back away toward his horse. The sheriff, his face a mixture of disgust and resolve, took a step away from Crowley and toward Sam. The world had shifted. Sam was no longer the cornered animal. He was empowered not by rage, but by his son's bravery. He didn't need to kill Crowley. He needed to end this. With a speed that defied his years away from the life, Sam closed the distance between them. Crowley, startled, tried to bring his gun around, but Sam was already there. He didn't draw. He struck a brutal, efficient movement. He broke Crowley's wrist with a sickening crack, sending the pistol flying into the dust. The fight was swift and merciless. Sam dismantled him with fists and fury, a controlled storm of violence that was not about killing, but about absolute domination. He left Crowley a broken, gasping heap on the ground. Tanner tried to run, but the townspeople who had followed from a distance, drawn by the confrontation, now surged forward, blocking his path. The corrupt judge was hauled off his horse before he could flee. The vendetta was over. Crowley was apprehended to be held for the federal marshal, who was already on his way. The law he had twisted to his own ends would now be his undoing. As quickly as it had arrived, the dust storm passed. The wind died down to a whisper, and the last rays of the setting sun broke through the clouds, bathing the ranch in a clean, golden light. The world felt scrubbed new. The immediate aftermath was a blur of motion and community. The townspeople, led by a determined Martha, did not leave. They descended on the ranch not as spectators, but as neighbors. They helped right a toppled fence, secured the loose shutters, and shared water from the well that was still pure. Their quiet, steady work was a balm, a collective act of mending that went far beyond the physical damage. They were helping the coal trains reclaim their homeboard by board nail by nail. When the last of them had gone and the deep blue of twilight settled over the valley, Sam and Karen stood on the porch, watching the stars begin to emerge. Eli was asleep inside, exhausted but peaceful for the first time in years. The silence between them was no longer heavy with secrets, but full of a profound shared relief. "I should have told you," Karen said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "About Crowley's brother. I found out weeks ago. I was afraid. I was afraid of what the truth would do to you." Sam turned to her, his face etched with weariness, but his eyes clear. He took her hand, his calloused thumb gently stroking her skin. "You were trying to protect us. To protect him." He glanced toward Eli's room. "You were trying to protect the man I'm trying to be, not the man I was." He finally spoke of the guilt he had carried for so long, and the words coming out in a slow, painful rush. He confessed his belief that his past was a curse that had followed him and cost Mary her life. "I thought I was the one who brought the darkness here," he murmured, his voice cracking. "But it was never me. It was him. It was your son who freed you from that." Sam, Karen said, her fingers tightening around his. "Not just from Crowley. From the ghost you've been living with." "No," Sam said, looking directly at her, his gaze intense and full of a love that needed no more hiding. "He gave me back my past. You gave me a reason to want a future." He leaned in and kissed her a kiss that was not born of passion or pain, but of a deep and abiding peace. It was a promise, a foundation, a homecoming. Later he went into Eli's room and stood by his bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's chest. He lightly touched Eli's hair. "Thank you," he whispered into the quiet room. "You saved us all." For the first time, Sam Coltrane felt the weight of his past, not as a burden to be carried, but as a long and difficult road that had against all odds led him home. They were married on the crest of the hill, overlooking the ranch on the very land they had almost lost. The wildflowers were in full bloom, a riot of Indian paintbrush and goldenrod against the deep green of the summer grass. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue. The townspeople were there not as a crowd, but as witnesses, as friends. Martha stood beside Karen, and the sheriff stood beside Sam. Karen wore a simple cream-colored dress, her hair woven with tiny white daisies Eli had picked for her that morning. She looked not at the makeshift altar, but at the two figures waiting for her. The tall, quiet man, whose soul was as rugged and resilient as the landscape around them. And the small boy who held his hand, his face alight with a smile that could chase away any shadow. There was no preacher. They spoke their own vows, simple words that held the weight of all they had endured and all they hoped to build. When Sam slipped a simple silver band on her finger, he held her hand for a moment longer. "I have something for you," he said, his voice low and for her ears only. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver locket suspended on a delicate chain. Mary's locket. Karen's breath caught. "This isn't to ask you to replace her," Sam said, his eyes holding hers full of honesty and love. "It's to ask you to help me build a future that honors the past we both carry. We are all made of scars, Karen. This is just one of mine." He fastened it around her neck. Tears welled in her eyes as she touched the cool metal. "I have something for you too," she whispered. She took the locket in her fingers and opened the small clasp. Sam looked down, a question in his eyes. Inside, nestled on one side, was the tiny faded portrait of Mary, a beautiful woman with kind eyes. But on the other side, where it had once been empty, Karen had placed something new, a single tiny wildflower, perfectly pressed, the same deep purple as the ones that grew wild by the creek, where Eli had first shown her his secret hiding place. "So we can add our own story," she explained softly. A slow smile spread across Sam's face, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire being. He saw it all in that one small gesture. She wasn't erasing his past, but adding to it, growing something new and beautiful alongside it. He kissed her, and the small gathering of friends erupted in cheers. Eli ran to them, and Sam swept him up, holding him in one arm, while the other wrapped securely around his wife. The three of them stood together on the hill, Sam, Karen, and a chattering, laughing Eli, looking out over the land that was finally truly theirs. The sun was warm on their faces, the wind was gentle, and their future, once a distant and uncertain horizon, was now as real and solid as the earth beneath their feet.